They say the wilderness doesn't care about your past, your medals, or the ghosts that follow you home. In the frozen gut of Alaska, silence is a warning, and preparation is the only religion that matters. William Wynne, a man built from granite and old scars, knew this better than anyone. While the new settlers in the valley spent their afternoons drinking and boasting about their modern heaters, William was doing something they deemed insane. Under the judgmental gaze of the townspeople, the 50-year-old veteran and his shadow, a 30-kilogram K9 named Smoky, were engaged in a bizarre ritual. Day after day, William hauled massive loads of seasoned oak and pine, not to a shed, but to the very peak of his cabin's roof. He reinforced the rafters with tactical precision, bolting steel plates to the timber. The settlers laughed. The old soldier has finally lost it. They jeered from their porches. He's hiding wood from the clouds. But William didn't look back. He didn't explain. He only felt the subtle drop in atmospheric pressure that his old leg wound always predicted. Smoky's ears remained pinned back, his moss-green eyes reflecting a storm that was still 1,000 miles away. They weren't just storing wood. They were building a fortress against the Titan. Every log hoisted was a silent middle finger to the arrogance of those who thought nature could be tamed with a thermostat. The laughter echoed in the valley, but in the woods, only the sound of William's heavy breathing and the metallic clinking of his pulleys remained. They had no idea that the roof wasn't just a ceiling. It was about to become the only dry ground in a world of white death. The countdown had already begun. The transition was not a gradual fade, but a violent slam of a door. By noon, the sun was a ghost, smothered by clouds that looked like bruised iron. The wind, which had been a whisper, began to scream through the pines, a low-frequency vibration that rattled the teeth. The temperature plummeted 40 degrees in 3 hours. While the settlers were still struggling to cover their outdoor wood piles with flimsy plastic sheets, William Wynne was already inside, battening down the hatches. Smoky paced the perimeter of the cabin, his claws clicking rhythmically on the hardwood floor. He didn't bark. He just stared at the reinforced door, his K9 instincts sensing the wall of ice moving toward them. Outside, the first flakes didn't fall. They were shot like bullets. The settlers' laughter died instantly, replaced by the frantic sounds of hammers and the shouting of men who realized their arrogance was about to cost them everything. Their firewood, stored in low-lying sheds and open pits, was quickly being buried under a rising tide of white. William sat in his leather chair, checking his tactical watch. 4 p.m. The darkness was absolute. He looked up at his ceiling. He could hear the weight of the snow beginning to press down on the roof, but he felt no fear. Between him and the sky was 2 tons of dry, dense wood and a reinforced steel frame. He had built a thermal battery above his head. Down in the valley, the first roof groaned and collapsed under the weight of the wet, heavy snow. The settlers' modern life was failing, one shingle at a time. The veteran took a slow sip of coffee, the steam rising in the dim cabin light. The real test had begun, and the mountain was about to start harvest. By the second day, the Thung Lung had become a graveyard of machinery and hope. The snow had reached 10 feet in the drifts, sealing doors and windows. In the settlers' camp, the disaster was absolute. Their firewood, buried under several feet of snow and soaked by the initial sleet, was frozen solid, useless ice blocks that refused to burn. Inside their thin-walled houses, the air was turning into a razor. They huddled together, burning furniture, their eyes wide with the realization that they were dying in the very place they intended to conquer. Up on the ridge, William Wynne lived in a different world. While the world outside was a frozen hell, his cabin was a sanctuary. He didn't need to step outside to dig for fuel. He simply reached through a small, strategically placed hatch in his ceiling. There, under protective layer the outer snow crust and the reinforced roof, lay his black gold. The wood was bone-dry, seasoned by the summer sun, and kept warm by the rising heat of the cabin. William pulled down a heavy log of oak. It felt warm to the touch. He split it with a single, practiced stroke of his hatchet. Smoky watched, his tail thumping against the floor. The fire in the hearth roared, fueled by the veteran's foresight. But William wasn't celebrating. He could hear the faint, desperate sound of a flare gun popping in the distance, a muffled thud against a screaming wind. Someone in the valley was signaling for a miracle. William looked at Smoky. The dog stood up, his muscles rippling under his thick coat, his eyes locked onto his master. The mockery of the previous weeks was gone, replaced by a cold, hard duty. William began to reach for his tactical winter gear. The veteran was going out. The door groaned as William threw the bolt, and the Alaskan winter didn't just enter, it invaded. A wall of white pulverized the warmth of the cabin in seconds. William Wynne, 50 years of grit and muscle, stepped into the abyss. Each step was a battle against a horizontal tide of ice that felt like needles against his exposed skin. Beside him, Smoky wasn't just a dog. He was a silent engine of fur and fury, his powerful 30-kilogram frame cutting through the drifts that would have swallowed a lesser creature. The visibility was zero. The world had lost its horizontal and vertical lines, leaving only a screaming, sightless void. But William didn't navigate with his eyes. He navigated with a soldier's intuition and the rhythmic tension on Smoky's leash. The K9's nose was tilted up, catching the faint, acrid scent of plastic burning, the desperate signal of the settlers in the valley. They were burning their own lives to stay warm, unaware that the toxic fumes were as dangerous as the cold. "Steady, boy," William grunted, his voice snatched away by the 100-mile-per-hour gusts. His moss-green eyes were squinted behind tactical goggles, tracking the faint, pulsing red of another flare. The valley floor was now a treacherous maze of buried rooftops and hidden air pockets. One wrong step meant falling through a chimney or into a hollow cavern of snow. But the veteran's feet were sure, his broad shoulders hunched against the gale. He wasn't just a man walking through a storm. He was a rescue mission of one, carrying the weight of the very people who had called him a fool. The irony wasn't lost on him, but in the heart of a blizzard, there is no room for spite, only the mission. The first house William reached belonged to the Millers, the loudest of the mockers. Now it was a silent tomb of ice. The front door was barricaded by a 6-foot drift, frozen into a solid wall. Inside, William could hear the low, rhythmic moaning of someone in the final stages of hypothermia. He didn't waste time with a shovel. He used his broad shoulders and a tactical sledgehammer he'd hauled from the ridge. Crack! The ice shattered. Boom! The wood gave way. When William stepped inside, the air was barely warmer than the storm outside. The Millers were huddled on the floor, wrapped in soaked blankets, their faces a ghastly shade of blue. They looked up, and for a moment, they thought they were seeing a ghost from a mountain. William didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't need to. His presence and the low, protective growl of Smoky said everything. He moved with the efficiency of a combat medic. He didn't build a fire with their wet wood. Instead, he pulled out bricks of the dry oak he'd carried in his pack, the wood from his roof. He shaved off thin curls of dry kindling with his knife. Within minutes, a small, intense flame began to lick at the hearth. The smell of real wood smoke filled the room, a scent of life in a house of shadows. The Millers watched in stunned silence as the man they had ridiculed saved their lives with the very thing they had laughed at. But the fire was only the beginning. William looked at his watch. There were 5 more houses, and the storm was only getting stronger. The night became a blur of broken doors and small fires. House after house, the pattern repeated. William Wynne and Smoky were like ghosts of the storm, appearing when the cold was about to claim its final victory. The veteran's body was a machine of endurance, but even he was beginning to feel the heavy toll. His lungs burned with every breath of the sub-zero air, and the muscles in his legs screamed as he dragged a makeshift sled filled with his precious roof wood from house to house. At the 3rd house, he found the young couple who had led the mocking. The man was unconscious, his feet black with frostbite. William didn't hesitate. He used his military training to stabilize the man, wrapping the limbs in dry wool from his own pack. He realized then that he couldn't keep going back and forth to his cabin. He needed a central hub. "Smoky, find them," he commanded, gesturing to the wind. The dog took off, his K9 training kicking into overdrive. Smoky wasn't just looking for people. He was looking for the strongest structure in the valley floor, the old stone church. If William could gather everyone there, they had a chance. But the church was at the lowest point, and the snow was accumulating there the fastest. As William struggled to carry the unconscious man through the drifts, he saw something that made his blood run colder than the blizzard. The river at the edge of the valley was jamming with ice, and the water was beginning to back up. The frozen trap was about to become a flooded grave. The sound was like a freight train grinding its brakes, a deep, tectonic groan that vibrated through the stone floor of the church. The ice jam on the river had finally snapped, but instead of clearing, it had diverted a surge of freezing, black water directly into the lower basin of the valley. William Wynne stood at the heavy oak doors, his moss-green eyes narrowing as he watched the white snow turn into a gray, slushy nightmare. The flood wasn't just water. It was an ice slurry that could crush a man's legs in seconds. "Up, get them to the choir loft." William's voice cracked like a whip, snapping the dazed settlers out of their hypothermic stupor. He didn't ask, he commanded, with the strength of a man half his age. He began hoisting the injured millers up the narrow spiral stone stairs. Smoky was at the base, his low, guttural bark acting as a literal sheepdog for the panicked survivors, nipping at the heels of those who froze in fear. The water hit the church doors with dull thud, seeping through the cracks in cold, rhythmic tongues. William looked back at the sled he'd brought. His last supply of dry roof wood was now floating. He dived into the waist-deep freezing slush, his muscles seizing from the thermal shock, to grab the precious logs. He knew that without fire in that loft, the damp cold would finish what the blizzard started. His broad shoulders strained as he fought the current inside the sanctuary, a lone soldier refusing to retreat against an invisible enemy. As he climbed the last step, the water slammed the doors open, filling the nave with a roar of ice and debris. They were high, but they were now trapped on a stone island in a sea of frozen death. Midnight, the loft was a cramped world of shadows and the smell of wet wool. Outside, the wind had reached a demonic pitch, vibrating the very stones of the church. The small fire William had built with his salvaged roof wood was the only thing keeping the group from slipping into the final sleep. He sat by the edge of the stairs, a silent sentinel, his hand resting on Smoky's heavy head. The K9 hadn't slept. His moss-green eyes, a mirror of his master's, stayed fixed on the dark water below. The silence among the settlers was heavy, broken only by the occasional sob. Then, one of the men who had been the loudest in his mockery, a man named Henderson, crawled toward William. He didn't speak at first, just stared at the small, flickering flame. "We thought you were a paranoid old fool, Wynne," he whispered, his voice cracking. "We thought the roof wood was a joke." William didn't turn his head. His gaze remained on the darkness. "Nature doesn't have a sense of humor, Henderson," he replied, his voice a low rumble. "It only has a balance sheet. And right now we're all in the red." Suddenly, Smoky stood up, a low growl vibrating in his chest. He wasn't looking at the water. He was looking at the ceiling. The weight of the snow on the church's ancient timber roof was reaching a critical mass. A loud, sharp crack echoed through the loft, a sound like a gunshot. The structural reinforcements William had used on his own cabin were missing here. The church was strong, but its crown was failing. William stood up, grabbing his tactical rope. He had to go up into the rafters, in the dark, to bridge a failing beam, or they would all be buried in stone and snow before dawn. High in the darkness of the church's skeleton, William Wynne was fighting a war of leverage. Every time the wind gusted, the roof shivered like a dying animal. He had managed to lash the primary failing rafter to a secondary stone support, but he needed a permanent anchor. He reached for a heavy iron bracket he'd found in the church's storage, but his hands, numb and battered, fumbled. The bracket plummeted toward the water below. "Smoky, catch!" William roared, a desperate gamble. Below, in the flickering light, the K9 didn't hesitate. Smoky didn't wait for the bracket to hit the floor. He tracked the falling iron with predatory precision and leapt from the loft railing. His powerful 30-kilogram body flew through the air, catching the heavy iron in his jaws before crashing into a floating wooden pew in the floodwater. The impact was violent, and for a moment, Smoky disappeared beneath the black surface. William's heart stopped. "Smoky!" he screamed. A second later, a black and tan head broke the water. The dog was swimming, the heavy iron bracket still clamped firmly in his teeth. He struggled against the current, dragging himself back toward the loft stairs. The settlers watched, paralyzed by the sheer bravery of the animal. William, fueled by a new surge of adrenaline, finished the lashing. The roof groaned one last time, then held. The anchor was set. As William descended the pillar, drenched and shivering, Smoky met him at the bottom of the stairs, dropping the bracket at his master's feet. The veteran collapsed onto the stone floor, pulling the freezing dog into his arms. They were both broken, bleeding, and exhausted, but they had held the line. The first light of dawn didn't bring warmth. It brought a cold, blue clarity that revealed the true scale of the devastation. The wind had finally died down to a rhythmic moan, leaving a world sculpted in jagged ice and gray slush. Inside the church loft, the small fire had dwindled to glowing embers. William Wynne sat upright, his back against a stone pillar, his moss-green eyes bloodshot but vigilant. Smoky lay across his lap, a heavy, warm weight that proved they had both survived the night of the rising ghost. As the settlers began to stir, the silence was absolute. No one spoke. The shame was a physical presence in the room, thicker than the frost on the windows. Henderson, the man who had led the ridicule weeks ago, stood at the edge of the loft, looking down at the flooded nave, where pews floated like coffins. He turned to William, his lips trembling from more than just the cold. "You didn't have to come for us, Wynne. After everything we said. Why?" William stood up slowly, his joints popping like dry twigs. He looked at Henderson, then at the shivering families. "Out here, the cold doesn't care who's right," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "It only cares who's prepared. My father used to say, in a storm, you don't build walls to keep people out. You build them to keep the fire in." He walked to the edge of the loft and looked toward the mountain. His cabin was still there, a dark speck against the white peak. The wood on his roof was still dry. The plan had worked, but the valley was gone. They needed to move. and they needed to move now before the stagnant water froze them into a permanent tomb. The journey back to the ridge was a test of survival that made the blizzard look like a warm-up. William had fashioned a crude litter for the injured using the church's tapestries and broken pews. He took the lead, his broad shoulders acting as a snowplow through the chest-deep drifts that had hardened into a crust of ice. Behind him, the survivors followed in a single, shivering line, stepping exactly where he stepped. Smoky was a flank guard. He ran back and forth along the line, his 30-kilogram body a blur of black and tan, nudging those who stumbled and barking a sharp warning when someone wandered too close to the hidden riverbank. The dog's K9 instincts were the only thing keeping them from the deadfall's deep pockets of air, hidden under the snow that could swallow a man whole. As they climbed higher, the air grew thinner and colder. The settlers, already weakened by days of freezing, began to flag. Henderson collapsed, his face buried in the snow. "Leave me," he gasped. I can't do it." William Wynne didn't say a word. He walked back, grabbed the man by the collar of his parka with one hand, and hauled him to his feet. "You laughed at me for putting wood on my roof," William growled, his face inches from Henderson's. "Now you're going to walk so you can see why I did it. You don't die today. Not on my watch." The veteran's eyes were like green ice, unyielding and terrifying. Henderson found a reserve of strength he didn't know he had. They kept moving upward toward the only sanctuary left in the world that had turned its back on them. When they reached the cabin, the settlers stared in awe. Up close, the insanity they had mocked looked like a masterpiece of engineering. The roof, which they had laughed at, was a massive, organized fortress of wood, shielded by the very snow that had destroyed their homes. Because William had reinforced the beams with steel and stacked the wood in a self-insulating pattern. The interior of the cabin was nearly 60 degrees warmer than the outside air. William didn't wait for a thank you. He went straight to the ceiling hatch. With Smoky watching with pride, William began pulling down the heavy, dry oak logs, the firewood in the roof. He threw them into the massive stone hearth, and soon the cabin was filled with a heat so intense it felt like a summer day. The settlers huddled on the floor, weeping as the warmth returned to their limbs. They looked up at the ceiling, seeing the gaps where the wood had been removed, realizing that every log above their heads was an hour of life William had stolen back from the winter. The mockery was officially dead. In its place was a silent, holy respect for the man and his dog. William Wynne, 50 years old, a veteran of wars they couldn't imagine, sat in his chair, cleaning Smoky's paws with a warm cloth. He had saved the people who hated him, using the very thing they hated him for. But as he looked at the horizon, he knew the world below would never be the same. The valley was gone, but the mountain had been mastered. The storm had passed, but the aftermath was a landscape of frozen silence. The blue Alaskan sky, now clear and heartless, looked down upon the devastated valley. Inside William's cabin, the air was warm and smelled of dry pine and coffee. While the settlers slept, exhausted from their ordeal, Henderson sat by the window, staring out at the white grave that used to be his home. He turned to look at William Wynne, who was sharpening an axe by the fire. "Wynne," Henderson began, his voice barely a whisper, "we didn't just mock your roof wood. We wrote a letter to the county, tried to have you evicted, called you a danger to the community." William didn't stop sharpening, the rhythmic scrape of stone against metal filling the silence. Smoky looked up from his paws, his moss-green eyes unblinking, tracking the settler's every move. "Danger isn't what it used to be," William finally replied, test firing the blade against his thumbnail. "You sought security in numbers. I sought it in wood. Looks like we were both wrong about what community means. But that doesn't matter now. The ice jam downriver is creating an unstable pool. When that fully breaks, it'll wash away whatever's left in the valley. We have one window to salvage what we can. He stood up, towering over the settler. I'm not saving you this time, Henderson. You're saving yourselves. Get them up. The descent was faster under the clear sky, but the silence in the valley was oppressive. What had once been a bustling settlement was now a chaotic tangle of ice, downed trees, and buried machinery. The settlers, led by William and Smoky, moved with frantic energy. The countdown of the downriver ice jam was echoing in everyone's mind. William directed the operation with military precision. He didn't focus on personal belongings. He focused on long-term survival tools. He sent the strongest men to salvage generators, fishing nets, and medical supplies from a half-buried general store. Smoky was invaluable. His K9 nose could detect fuel and livestock under 10 feet of snow. He led the settlers to a buried barn, barking relentlessly until they dug a trench. Inside, they found 2 frozen but alive cattle, huddled in the only remaining dry pocket. It was a miracle of survival, found only by the K9's acute senses. The former mockers were no longer mocking. They were sweating in the sub-zero air, following the orders of the 50-year-old veteran and his dog. Even Henderson was covered in muck, helping drag a generator onto a sled. The mockery of the roof would have been replaced by the realization that preparation, in all its forms, was the only form of currency that mattered here. As the sun began to dip, a distant groan rumbled from downriver. The ice jam was moving. The window was closing. The groan from downriver intensified into a roar that shook the very foundation of the mountain. The ice jam, that towering blue monster, was finally collapsing. A wall of black water and crushing ice blocks, each the size of a cabin, rushed down the valley floor. William's group had just reached the high ground of the ridge when the first wave hit. It swallowed the general store and Henderson's remaining house in seconds, pulverizing them into splinters and ice slurry. The force was apocalyptic. They were safe on the ridge, but not from the debris. A huge, fragmented piece of timber, the main beam from the general store, was sent fly by the flood and came crashing toward the group on the trail. It missed William but struck Henderson's leg, pinning him to a large rock near the edge of the slope. The flood water was rising fast, and another ice surge was coming. William couldn't reach him. He was stabilizing the rest of the survivors on the narrow trail. "Smoky, the rope!" William yelled, a dynamic tactical shout. Smoky, already carrying a coil of tactical rope in his harness, didn't hesitate. He scrambled down the unstable, ice-slick rock face toward the pinned settler. Smoky used his jaws to loop the rope around Henderson's free wrist and then brace his 30-kilogram body, digging his claws into the frozen rock. William and Henderson's wife, on the other end, pulled with all their strength. Just as a second surge of black water slammed the rock below, they hauled Henderson up. The floodwater roared past, empty where Henderson had been seconds ago. As Smoky scrambled back up the ridge, shaking the ice water from his coat, the settlers looked at the K9 and his master. The mockery of the past was gone. They had just seen salvation. The valley below was now a graveyard of black sludge and pulverized ice. The roar of the collapse had faded, leaving a silence more absolute than the blizzard itself. On the high ridge, under a brutal, sun-bleached blue sky, the survivors huddled on the narrow trail. William Wynne stood the edge, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the devastation, his moss-green eyes looking not at the ruin, but at Henderson, who was being treated for his crushed leg using a salvaged medical kit. Smoky lay across Henderson's chest, the K9's black and tan coat still caked in frozen mud, His expression not aggressive, but possessive. Henderson looked up at the 50-year-old veteran, tears of shame and gratitude blurring the frost on his eyelashes. "You were right, Wynne," Henderson whispered, his voice cracking like thin ice. "About the roof wood, about everything. We thought community was a political boundary. We thought numbers meant safety. But real community, it's not who you live near. It's who will stand between you and the dark. I almost drowned because I was too proud to listen. We almost died because we were too busy mocking you." The other settlers nodded, their previous animosity forgotten, replaced by a deep, silent awe for the man and his dog. William didn't answer immediately. He only looked at Smoky, then back at the group. The reckoning in the snow was over. The valley was gone, but the lesson would endure as long as they lived. The settlers couldn't rebuild the valley. The flood had left it an unstable ruin of mud and ice. They needed a new home. Together, using the salvaged materials and William's tactical guidance, they began the arduous process of relocation. William Wynne and Smoky didn't live with them. They returned to their sanctuary on the ridge. But the veteran and his dog were no longer outcasts. The paranoid fool was now the chief engineer and security advisor of the new settlement. Day after day, the sound of axes and hammers filled the air as new cabins, built with reinforced beams and proper foundations, rose from the high ground near the river, at a safe distance this time. They didn't bury their wood in hovels. They stacked it openly, but with structural intelligence. They looked at the veteran and his dog, who often patrolled the perimeter with a calm, fierce presence, not with mockery, but with a holy respect. William and Smoky had proven that preparation wasn't paranoia. It was prophecy, and in the heart of the unforgiving Alaskan wilderness, prophecy was the only thing that kept the darkness at bay. The new town grew strong, built not just with lumber and steel, but with a hard-won knowledge. Henderson, now the mayor, often told the story of the veteran and his dog to the children, but the legendary man himself was rarely seen. William Wynne and Smoky lived in their reinforced cabin on the highest ridge, above the tree line. Every year, before the first frost, William was seen hoisting tons of seasoned wood onto his roof. The settlers would look up, some of them smiling, but they didn't laugh. Instead, they checked their own wood piles. William had taught them that the mountain was a beast, and a beast always returns. He had won his war, not against men, but against the White Death itself. He had mastered the mountain by preparing for its worst. One night, as Henderson looked out at the lights of his thriving new town, he raised a metal mug toward the peak. To William Wynne and the prophecy of the roof wood, he whispered. 1,000 feet above him, a moss green, I watched the valley from the shadows. Smoky's K9 form was at his master's side, unmoving, his ears alert to the silent warnings that only he could hear. The master was always watching, and the fire would always be in the roof. Spring in Alaska is not a rebirth. It is an unmasking. As the massive snowpacks began to retreat, they revealed secrets that the blizzard had fought to keep hidden. One evening, Smoky began to howl, a sound William hadn't heard since his days in the Special Operations Unit. It wasn't a warning of a predator. It was a recognition of a frequency. Deep beneath the melting permafrost, near the edge of William's Ridge, a mechanical hum began to vibrate the ground. The flood hadn't just destroyed the valley. It had shifted the tectonic plates of the mountain, exposing the entrance to a long-forgotten Cold War relay station. William Wynne stood at the mouth of a jagged fissure, his moss-green eyes narrowing. He knew the scent. Ozone and old grease. The settlers, now living in their new high-ground homes, watched from below as a strange, rhythmic light began to pulse from the peak. The paranoid veteran, realized that the firewood on his roof was no longer his biggest concern. Something dormant had been woken up by the storm, and it was sending a signal to a world that thought it was dead. William gripped his tactical flashlight, his broad shoulders tensing. "Smoky, get up," he rasped. The survival story was about to become a ghost hunt. The bunker wasn't just a relic. It was a trap. The red dots on the monitor weren't just icons. Hissing sounds from the vents revealed that the station was venting pressurized methane, a byproduct of the ancient cooling systems failing. One spark, and the entire ridge, including William's cabin and the firewood sanctuary, would be vaporized. The ghost signal was a distress sequence, but it was also a self-destruct countdown. William Wynne worked with the surgical focus of a man who had defused IEDs in a dozen different deserts. But this was different. The tech was analog, vacuum tubes, and heavy copper. "Smoky, find the leak," he ordered. The K9 darted into the dark, his nose ignoring the smell of old death to find the sharp scent of the gas. As William bypassed the main computer, he realized the settlers below were in the path of the venting gas if it reached the valley floor. He had saved them from the ice, but now he had to save them from a fire they couldn't even see. Every second the blue light pulsed. The pressure grew. His moss-green eyes scanned the blueprints on the wall. He needed to vent the gas through the old chimney stacks, the very stacks hidden under his own firewood piles on the roof. To save the valley, he might have to sacrifice his sanctuary. The choice was binary: keep the wood and lose the people, or burn the wood and save the world. William Wynne didn't hesitate. He knew the value of a sanctuary, but he knew the value of a soul more. He overrode the bunker's safety valves, forcing the methane up through the central heating shafts of his own cabin. "Get out! Smoky! Go!" he yelled. The K9 whined, refusing to leave his master's side as the bunker groaned under the pressure. William grabbed the dog and shoved him toward the exit fissure, then turned back to pull the final release. On the surface, the cabin roof erupted, not with fire, but with a colossal jet of pressurized gas that sent his meticulously stacked firewood flying like matchsticks into the night sky. To prevent the gas from settling in the valley, William fired a single flare into the vent. A pillar of fire, 200 feet high, lit up the Alaskan night. His sanctuary, his wood, the work of years, it all went up in a glorious, terrifying inferno. From the valley, the settlers watched in horror and awe as the mountain seemed to bleed fire. William would emerge from the fissure, clothes scorched, hair singed, but standing tall. He watched his cabin burn, the moss-green eyes reflecting the destruction of his own hard-won peace. Smoky sat beside him, leaning his head against the veteran's charred leg. They were homeless again, but the valley was safe. The morning after the Great Fire was a landscape of ash and iron. The ridge, once home to the most fortified cabin in Alaska, was now a smoking scar on the mountain. William Wynne sat on a charred stone bench, his muscular frame looking smaller amidst the ruins of his sanctuary. His moss-green eyes were fixed on the black skeleton of his roof, the roof that had saved the valley twice, and had finally been sacrificed to save a third time. But as the sun crested the peaks, the silence was broken not by the wind, but by the rhythmic thud of boots. Henderson led the procession, but he wasn't alone. Every able-bodied person from a new settlement was there, carrying lumber, tools, and supplies. They didn't come to ask for help. They came to provide it. For the first time in his 50 years, the veteran who prepared for everything found himself unprepared for kindness. "The mountain took your roof, Wynne," Henderson said, stepping forward with a heavy beam of seasoned cedar. "So we brought you a new one, and this time you're not building it alone." Smoky stood up, his black and tan coat bristling for a second before he realized the intent. The dog let out a short, approving bark. The settlers didn't just bring wood. They brought the same reinforced steel plates William had once used, forged in the valley's new workshop. The man who had spent a lifetime as a lone sentinel was about to learn that a true fortress isn't made of logs, but of the people who refuse to let you stand in the cold. The morning after the Great Fire was a landscape of ash and iron. The ridge, once home to the most fortified cabin in Alaska, was now a smoking scar on the mountain. William Wynne sat on a charred stone bench, his muscular frame looking smaller amidst the ruins of his sanctuary. His moss-green eyes were fixed on the black skeleton of his roof, the roof that saved the valley twice and had finally been sacrificed to save a third time. But as the sun crested the peaks, the silence was broken not by the wind, but by the rhythmic thud of boots. Henderson led the procession, but he wasn't alone. Every able-bodied person from the new settlement was there, carrying lumber, tools, and supplies. They didn't come to ask for help. They came to provide it. For the first time in his 50 years, the veteran who prepared for everything found himself unprepared for kindness. "The mountain took your roof, Wynne," Henderson said, stepping forward with a heavy beam of seasoned cedar. "So we brought you a new one. And this time you're not building it alone." Smoky stood up, his black and tan coat bristling for a second before he realized the intent. The dog let out a short, approving bark. The settlers didn't just bring wood. They brought the same reinforced steel plates William had once used, forged in the valley's new workshop. The man who had spent a lifetime as a lone sentinel was about to learn that a true fortress isn't made of logs, but the people who refuse to let you stand in the cold. Years passed, and the story of the veteran who had wood in his roof became a foundation of Alaskan folklore. William Wynne didn't seek fame. He remained the quiet ghost of the ridge. But he was never alone. Every winter, the townspeople would bring him the first cut of the season's wood, a ritual of respect for the man who saved them. As William reached his twilight years, his broad shoulders may have rounded slightly, and his salt and pepper hair turned to pure silver, but his moss-green eyes never lost their fire. Smoky, too, grew gray around the muzzle, but his loyalty remained an unbreakable bond. They had survived the blizzard, the flood, and the ghost of a forgotten war. In the final scene of our story, we see William Wynne and Smoky standing on the peak as a new storm begins to brew on the horizon. But this time there is no fear. The valley below is prepared. The houses are reinforced. The heat is steady. William Wynne looks at the gray clouds, then at the dog who had been his only friend in the dark. He reaches up to his roof, pulls down a single dry log of oak, and tosses it into the fire. The flame roars to life, a symbol of a man who knew that survival isn't just about living through the storm, but about making sure others have the wood to burn when the wind starts to scream. The master of the mountain has earned his rest, for he has turned a wasteland into a home.